Whooping Crane Chronicles is a collection of stories to learn from, to ponder, and to celebrate. I'm Mike Forsberg, a conservation photographer from the Great Plains. I've spent the last 5 years, camera in hand, exploring the natural history of whooping cranes across the continent, meeting the people who love them, and discovering how these tall, magnificent, and rarest of cranes are navigating our 21st century world. This podcast elevates conservation stories and uplifts these birds to showcase their natural history and beauty in the hope of keeping these birds around for generations to come. Join me on the journey. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Today, it's late May, and we are back on the Platte River in Nebraska at Audubon's Rose Sanctuary. We are here with Thomas Labedz, Gary Lingle, and Greg Wingfield, and I'm a little reluctant to say who you all are because you've done so many damn things in your life, and you're all so old. You're older than I am. But Tom is a seasoned zoologist and former collections manager at the University of Nebraska State Museum, known for his expertise in Nebraska's wildlife and natural history. Gary is a longtime Platte River ecologist, ornithologist, who has spent decades monitoring whooping cranes and other species along the Platte. And we'll go a lot more into Gary's background because there's too much to read here. Greg, same for you. You're a respected wildlife biologist, conservationist whose work in Nebraska has helped shape habitat protection and migration research for whooping cranes. So you all have come from, well, not very far away and very far away today. So thanks for being here, all of you. So where we're going to start is I think we're just going to do around the room. And now that I've introduced you, I'm going to make you introduce yourselves. Again, we'll start with Thomas.
Hello, it's good to be here. I've listened to some of the podcasts, and this is really fun. This is neat. And I'm from Nebraska, grew up in Omaha, and escaped as soon as I could, and came out here, and really haven't left. My heart's still here.
Yeah.
But I first came out here probably at the sanctuary in 1975, just a year or two after it opened. And my first field notes are from working on the sanctuary in 1977. And I think the first whooping cranes I saw were here on the sanctuary in 1980.
Wow.
It's, this is home.
Tell me about that. We'll get to this later maybe, but tell me about it now so it doesn't slip away, that first whooping crane sighting of yours.
It's kind of fuzzy in my memory. This is why I write notes everywhere.
Right.
Because I have trouble remembering things. But I have a note in there. There were 5 whooping cranes that were seen from the bridge, the Minden Bridge, and they were coming off of the Rose Sanctuary. And I wouldn't have written it if I hadn't been there to see it.
Is that spring or fall?
It was spring. It was April, mid-April sometime. And I think we'd been burning the pastures on the north section on the other side of the river. And that maybe had sucked them in.
Yeah.
But what I remember more about it was the interviews afterward from the Fish and Cleve Vaughn. You had Fish and Wildlife Service law enforcement and Game and Parks people were really grilling about what did you see, and that maybe already drove home how important these birds are.
Because back then, so you said 1980?
That was 1980.
So back then in 1980, about how many whooping cranes did we have?
About 80.
I'm going to say 75 when I started.
Wow, okay.
Somewhere, mid-70s.
Okay.
I do remember a picture that you sent me a couple years ago. I believe, I don't know if the number was 76 or so in Saskatchewan, but there were more in that one frame that they had in the population when I started here.
So,
There was a similar situation here in the Platte, too, where there were so many together a few years ago. I don't know if it was here at Row, it was somewhere, but there were so many together. That was maybe more than existed when I first saw it.
That was in fall of 2021. That was the fall that I saw that large group of birds up in Saskatchewan, and they ended up just, I think, by chance of the way that the weather patterns were, once the ice took over the wetlands up there and it got cold, that whole group just moved together, and that was the same group that ended up down here on the Central Platte River. So
now with the whoopers, you got to go back 10 years before my first sighting. I remember the first time I didn't see a whooping crane. But I was at scout camp on the Platte River, and I was maybe 13 years old, and there's two big white birds out on the sandbar. And when stretched their wings and black wingtips, somehow at that age, those were whooping cranes.
yeah,
I went and got a camp counselor, and they came down with binoculars with, no, those are pelicans. Okay. But that's, so first time I didn't see it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, big black wingtips.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's lots of reports.
I thought you were going to say, like, I'm going to do another book someday on whooping cranes, and it's going to be all the photographs of things that I thought were whooping cranes.
Oh, that'd be good.
Plastic bags and
Yes.
white irrigation pipes and all that stuff. So, well, Greg, we heard from you next. Where are you from? Who are you? Why are you here, Greg?
Why am I here?
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Grew up in northwest Kansas and went to Kansas State University. I ended up here, kind of, if you want to go down a rabbit hole, pretty interesting sort of way. I wasn't really too interested in wildlife when I was a kid. I hunted with my dad, pheasants a little bit, and that was about it. So went to school like a lot of people didn't know what they wanted to do. I was reading your Great Plains book the other day, and you mentioned reading a little story about ferrets, black-footed ferrets, to your daughter.
Yeah.
That's kind of what started me up here. There was a guy that did work in South Dakota, Bob Henderson, on ferrets, and he was the wildlife damage specialist down at K-State when I was there, so I got real interested in that. He also raised coyotes to do informational films with, so I raised coyotes for him. I met a good friend of mine that's just right down the road here, Bob Meduna.
Yeah, right.
Bob got a job up here at Sac Wilcox. I was going to sit out and maybe a year and work back at home and then think about graduate school. Bob said they had a job here at Sac Wilcox. Applied for that job, and they had a local guy that wanted to give that job to, and so they said, how about if you go up to Pine Ridge? Didn't know much about it, looked at the map, and that looked okay. So
We're out in the western part of the
I got
state.
my job up in Northwest, my first summer job up there, and about 3 weeks after I got that job, there was a guy that came up, and he was banding eagles and prairie falcons and needed a little help. Couldn't do that by himself, so I met Ross Locke there, and 6 months later, I got a job in the non-game area.
Yeah.
And eventually, that led me to row and hooping cranes and all sorts of fun stuff.
So Nebraska Game and Parks Commission was your door.
They were the employer. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Which is where I met you, too, back in the
In your
days,
younger days.
in my younger days, back in the 90s, yeah.
Back in the 90s.
And Gary Lingle, I first met you, I believe I was working on a story for Nebraska Land magazine called Wet Meadows of the Platte. Mm-hmm. And it was the first in-depth piece I think I was gonna do, something really dig in. And that was, I believe, in like 1994 or so. So you were working with the Platte River Whooping Crane Maintenance Trust at the time.
Right.
But take us back before that.
Well, I grew up just outside of Detroit at Warren, Michigan.
Right.
And it was, at that time, fairly rural area. In fact, we raised horses, and it was kind of vegetable farming country there. Now it's all tar and cement. But at any rate, I went to undergraduate school at Central Michigan University and studied biology. And from there, I decided to continue on in graduate school and and went up to Michigan Technological University for a master's degree in their forestry department, but they had a major within the forestry department that I pursued in wildlife ecology. And so having graduated there in 1977, I was applying for jobs the spring of 78 and got hired through Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in North Dakota, who were just kicking off a study here called the Platte River Ecology Study. And so I was hired for a 3-month temporary job as part of that particular study, and I've been here ever since. And so that's kind of wore a lot. I've worn a lot of different hats during that time. So the first job was with Fish and Wildlife Service, and then Nature Conservancy had just purchased an area, Mormon Island Crane Meadows, south of Grand Island along the Platte River, and they were looking for a habitat manager at that time, 1980 of the spring, and I was hired for that position as their preserve manager, and that led to then transferring over to the Whooping Crane Trust that was newly established about that same time frame. This was not by design or by plan, but the whooping cranes have pretty much dictated my career. Were it not for the whooping cranes, I'd have probably never wound up in Nebraska. So I worked for the Whooping Crane Trust for, I think, 16 years, working on habitat preservation and also doing field studies on lots of different migratory birds. It actually wasn't until 1983 that I finally saw my first whooping crane on the Platte River. And that was in the fall then. A group of 7 had landed and reported by landowners just between Grand Island and Kearney here. So that following morning, we rented a plane, and I had a person on the ground, went out to try to locate the birds from the ground, and we were up at sunrise, just prior to sunrise, trying to locate these birds, which we did from the plane. And they had left the river and landed in a field adjacent to the river. Within about an hour, they were joined by another family group. So there were actually eight birds in that particular field at that time, which represented more than 10% of the dire wolf population of whooping cranes. Later on, I went to work with the university through the Cooperative Extension, was Platte River Watershed Coordinator, and then we started a consulting firm and ended up finishing up my career as a consultant working primarily with whooping cranes, doing the initial monitoring with the Platte River Recovery and Implementation Program. So from the spring of 2001 through the spring of 2015, we were doing these surveys, both spring and fall, looking for whoopers along a 90-mile stretch here from Grand Island, roughly, Chapman, to Lexington. So during that time, like I say, spring of 2015 was the last survey that we conducted, and I retired shortly after that.
Well, you've probably seen more whooping cranes than just about anybody else that lives.
Well, no, not anymore. I would have said that 15 years ago. But yeah, when there was I think there were 80-some birds on the river that fall you're talking about. I mean, that is incredible. More birds than existed in the population. But I kind of tallied up what we located during that 15 or 14 years of surveys was 220 whooping cranes.
There is always a date.
267 whooping cranes.
Thomas, I'll ask you this first, I guess. What was the tenor of conversation around whooping cranes and the Platte River in general and conservation in general back in the 70s, early 80s?
It was tense. I think a lot of it was an opinion that the Endangered Species Act and whooping cranes was going to be used as a means to take over property along the Platte and take over water in the Platte from agricultural uses and maybe industrial uses. And I remember as a college student here at Kearney, going to testify at Newark, the little village down by Fort Kearny, at a public hearing about the bike hike trail over the river, and to talk about it in a favorable light. And so many people were there and not wanting that there because it would draw attention to the river, attention to the cranes. And they just I think a lot of the agriculture in the area just wanted it to go away. And in the early days of crane watching along the Platte River, you would just go stand on the bridge. There weren't any platforms to go. You just go stand on the highway bridge. And there was a lot of negative horn honking and of the tourists, and then if you were driving the road slowly, you would get harassed a little too. It has changed immensely, and during the 50th anniversary of the sanctuary here, I was talking with one of the people that was with Audubon at that time, and I remember them being rejected in trying to get a couple $100 from one of the chambers of commerce to print crane watching guideline brochures to distribute. Nobody thought anything would come of cranes and the Platte River. Yeah, it's a little different today. It's big business and everybody seems to want in on it. But in the initial time period there, it was pretty negative.
What was your experience like, Greg?
That Kansas was a great term, but I would qualify that by saying, particularly along the Platte River, anything to do with irrigation. And but I had the pleasure, I guess, of being able to run all over the state for the state of Nebraska, trying to confirm any reported sightings. And away from the Platte, least up like in Sandhills wetlands or farm ponds scattered around, I think it was certainly different attitudes. There was a little more curiosity. There was still, private landowners that were a little bit leery. I mean, the Endangered Species Act was just a couple of years old when I started, so it was brand new, no history of how it's going to be used. And so a little different attitude there, and I think a little more interest. And I'm trying to think, I can't remember really any bad experiences. I'd be up on a group of whooping cranes for 4 or 5 days and eventually get to know most of the people in the area. And a lot different attitude there when they didn't perceive that as a direct threat to their livelihood.
What was your sense, Gary?
I would describe it as contentious, is the word. For reasons that Thomas mentioned and Greg as well, as far as the perception of threatening a way of life from the agricultural community. There was a definite attitude there, concern that livelihoods may be impacted by this Endangered Species Act, and restrictions would be placed upon landowners as far as their operations were concerned. And the Whooping Crane Trust was born out of this contentious atmosphere. Was the first major lawsuit that resulted in an establishment of an organization whose mission was to protect habitat for whooping cranes, sandhill cranes, and other migratory bird species along the Platte River. And so there was a $7.5 million settlement that established this trust, which at the time, the National Wildlife Federation was a party to this lawsuit, and they had never dreamed of a settlement in the amount of that magnitude. While at the same time, the Power District, who was also a party to the lawsuit, felt like $7.5 million is cheap. If we can get out from underneath any of these restrictions with $7.5 million, man, we're happy as can be. So it was an interesting difference in attitude there. But anyhow, the $7.5 million as far as the local folks coming back to the local area, that was a big amount of money that people were fearful we're going to come in and purchase all this land and drive the local residents off. And one of the first meetings that the trustees had discussing this very issue, and it was decided right then and there that the one thing that they wanted to do above all else would be a good neighbor and not, try to somehow dissuade this negative perception that was out there. And in time, it took time, but in time, I think that's happened. But the first few years, the first 10 years, it was very contentious.
Well, and that was, I don't remember dates very well. I'm not a good historian, but I think wasn't there a proposal around that time to create a national wildlife refuge?
There was,
within the Central Platte corridor.
Right, it was on Shoemaker Island, and the landowners there, in fact, when I first started here, when we drove upon Shoemaker Island, there was a big wooden sign that said, "This land is protected by," and it had the list of the names of the people who owned that land. So that never came to be as far as a national wildlife refuge, but today now, I don't know what the total number of acres are there protected by conservation groups, but I'm guessing it's probably near 20,000 acres.
There also was a big reservoir proposed.
With Two Forks,
How many reservoirs?
yeah, there was a lot.
Several projects.
Exactly. And the one project that formed the trust was in Wyoming on the, what the heck river was it now? I can't.
North Platte.
Well, it was a tributary of the North Platte, but
it's Great Rocks.
Great Rocks, Wheatland, Wyoming.
Right.
And that resulted in the establishment of the trust. But then there was, Colorado had Two Forks, and then Prairie Bend and Mid-State here in Nebraska.
Narrows project.
The Narrows Project. There was a number of water projects, most of which weren't actually ultimately constructed.
Well, the Mid-State one is one that I know would have been very significant, but I oftentimes don't hear about it. Greg, could you explain?
Boy, that goes way back, and I can't remember too many of the details, but it was, certainly a reservoir in Nebraska, so it would have had a very quick and direct impact. The others we've talked about are further upstream.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Mid-States was an early one. I think there might have been one or two others in Nebraska. It's kind of, the joke was they don't go away, they just rename them. Early part of my career, I was lucky. I got to do the fun stuff, and the guy that hired me, Ross Locke, he started having to do the endangered species consultations and dig into the weeds on all the impacts of the projects. And, basically after I was here for a year or two, that's what he did. He just did the consultations, and I got to do the fun stuff. And, it was a period of probably 15 years that he was working on various water projects.
And some of those meetings got very heated. Those public hearings.
Yeah.
I was nose to nose with some landowners, red-faced and angry. I mean, it got very heated during those times. But things have changed tremendously since then.
So you've all said that. You've all said that things have changed tremendously since then. And since then, now is we're looking at 40 years plus, right? Thomas, why do you think things have changed?
Everything changes, and I'm accepting of change. Things are going to change. We just have to be prepared to see which way they're going to go and try to work with it. My career hasn't been on the Platte. My career has been in museums. And I've only been on the periphery for the last 40 years. Been lucky enough just to come out here and touch base occasionally, or fly with the crew, or be on ground crew or something. I think it's a lot more nice. It's just nicer. I think sandhill cranes have been a great ambassador for whooping cranes here.
How so?
Financially.
Yeah.
Financially. It's big business out here in March and April. And I think the acceptance of that has led to some degree the acceptance of whooping cranes coming through here and people babysitting them very tightly in some cases. But
yeah, I think it's something around $15 million or so gets dropped into the local economies here if you sort of triangulate Hastings, Grand Island, Kearney, and the small communities around the way, which is a pretty good drop in the bucket for a 5-6 week period.
I think some of the fears of condemnation, obviously they didn't play out. So, early on, like you mentioned, there was all this fear it's just going to come in and take land, and that didn't happen. The act was used, it's not only whooping cranes, but terns and plovers and all the endangered species in the ecosystem here on the Platte. I think people eventually figured out that this is not going to go away. We got to figure out a better way than constantly, going through these formal consultations. Nobody wanted those. There was the whole FERC relicensing process for Lake McConaughey. And I think gradually over time, begrudgingly, some of the water interests figured out we can't keep doing this. And, you can skip forward several years and then talk about the Platte River Recovery Program, but a lot of just factors, I think, played into the fact that we're going to have to live with this. And so people started changing how they tried to work with it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the condemnation. That was a huge fear that land was going to be condemned and taken away. And the other thing that I remember was a major concern from the landowners was the tax base. If this organization is going to come in, buy up all this land, they're a nonprofit, and so all these properties are going to be taken off the tax base and increase taxes, property taxes for the neighbors. And again, that was one of the things the trustees, right from the get-go, decided that they were going to do is pay full and fair property taxes. That was not going to be, a fear that would come to fruition.
Yeah.
maybe you guys can help me with my memory here. It was at that transition point when I was working for Fish and Wildlife and then transitioning to working for the Trust. There was an ag crisis or something at that time. Mm-hmm. And I have some recollection of these, some of the ag people realizing that they might be going under.
Farm Aid was,
and they were also realizing that the trust had $7.5 million, and maybe they could pay a fair price for their property.
It's happened.
And they were coming in the door to talk to John,
right.
and asking to sell their stuff because they thought maybe they could make a little more on it.
Yeah,
am I right?
Yeah, the land prices just plummeted, and so some of these same people that were very standoffish did come to the door and say, look, we would like to try and get, we'll sell you our land for a fair price. I think, the Crane Trust, I think we ended up, while I was there during my tenure, we purchased about 10,000 acres from willing sellers. And that number, I guess, has since doubled with the other groups. But yeah, absolutely, that was the case.
Well, we've talked a lot about humans and boundaries and borders and policies and legalities and all of that around what's obviously a very precious river and river valley. When you look at, so we're in a new part of Audubon Rose Sanctuary's building. We're looking out over some big picture windows here at a river. And I know we've been seeing some birds fly through because you guys' eyes keep going up there. It's like the Archibald. Yeah. Can you tell us, I want each of you to tell our listeners a little bit about the Platte and its nations of creatures that call this place home and what it means.
Braided rivers in general are really rare. There's only a handful of them in the entire continent.
What does that mean to be a braided river, Gary?
A braided river, it has an unconsolidated substrate that sandbars are constantly in flux, forming and washing away. there's not one main channel within, whether we got the outside channels that constrains the river, but within that outer banks, it's a constantly changing river because of the material that's made up of the sand.
So is it safe to say that if we went all and stood in the river four abreast right now, we wouldn't be standing in the same place very long?
Things will be changing constantly underfoot. Exactly.
Yeah, just kind of fun examples of that. We would try to pinpoint where a hooping crane roosted out on sandbar overland, and you go back the next day to walk out there. You better be careful when you step off the bank. Maybe a 4-foot channel versus a 6-inch channel overnight. And this from your time-lapse stuff. Just great examples of it.
The other thing, coming from outside the state originally, people, and this is just a general human characteristic, you tend to take for granted what's in your own backyard. And of course, the sandhill cranes focus here on this river. 80% of the world's sandhill cranes stop here every spring. The resource here is world class. And you add to it the endangered species and whooping cranes. I mean, it is a major stop for whooping cranes, and we've cataloged over 300 species of migratory birds that utilize this central Platte habitat. And that's, many of these birds are neotropical migrants, those that winter down in the tropics and migrate northwards to nest and come here to either nest or just use the river or in the surrounding environment in transit to heading to nesting grounds further north. But we're in the center of the continent. It's the biological crossroads for many species. We have species hybridizing here that, it's unique from that standpoint. We got rose-breasted grosbeaks to the east and black-headed grosbeaks to the west, and right in the middle we have this zone of hybridization, and there's a number of species like that. It's an incredible resource, especially if you're anywhere and have any interest at all in natural history. It's incredible.
I feel like we're standing right in the middle of Main Street watching this great parade.
It's amazing. It really is. East and west joins together, and north and south. It's quite a unique area.
Many places, when they have a bird migration, they have a migration. Here it is. It's March or it's April or it's May. But my experience here in Nebraska has been that every month of the year there is something migrating, something moving through here, and it's depending on ice conditions or weather conditions or who knows what, or just the biology of the birds. There's about the time in a month from now, we're going to be seeing the last of the northbound shorebirds touching down here on the Platte.
What would those shorebirds be?
White-rumped sandpipers.
White-rumped sandpipers. And where are they going?
Somewhere in the Arctic. North, I don't know.
And the second week of July, we'll be seeing the first southbound shorebirds on the Platte River. It's just, we're always in migration. In winter, it'll be geese moving or eagles or
something different. I mean, one of
constant.
I've seen a lot of amazing things here, and one of the ones is just like a tornado of snow geese in some migrations. So come down and make the sandhill cranes look like they don't know what a population is, what a dense population is. There's always something different.
I have distinct memories of doing a river channel transect over by the Trust, and spiraling out of the sky comes avocets and godwits to join us on the river. And I remember another time out doing, when it was so bloody windy that we were having trouble holding the stakes up for the survey team. And there was a Baird sandpiper taking shelter, using me as a windbreak on the sandbar. It's just, get out there and you just go sit out there for a while. You'll be part of it.
Yeah.
And they'll come to you too.
I do remember another time, and this wasn't a fun time. This was a sad time. This was in 1997, maybe, or 8. It was, we were picking up dead sandhill cranes.
Oh, yes.
You want to talk?
It's 96.
96. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, it was a unique weather situation that happened. It was, I think, the 31st or so, or 30th of March, kind of at the peak of the migration for sandhill cranes. the day started out in the 40s and rain, and drizzle and rain. And as the day went on, the temperature kept dropping. The rain didn't. The rain finally changed to ice pellets or something. But what happened was by sunset, temperatures had dropped, the winds had come up, wind chills by midnight were in that 40 to 50 below zero. And things literally froze overnight. The peak of this storm hit at the time the cranes were trying to work their way back to the river to roost. And I was living at a house on the trust ground now, Wild Rose, about a half mile from the river. And I remember in the middle of the night hearing these loud thumps against the house, with bang and bang every now and then. The wind was howling. In the morning, I got up and it was crane. There were dead cranes laying everywhere. The river had froze during that night, forcing the birds off the river. They had to fly in the peak of this horrendous storm. And the vortex, we ended up going around collecting dead cranes at that time. I think we ended up with about 300 birds, and about 15 or 16, I think they were figured, would fill the back of the bed of a pickup truck, frozen like that. So it was just showed you the power of nature, and how that was one of the concerns with whooping cranes. We have such a small number that a weather event could be, in the case of the wintering grounds, especially for whoopers, a hurricane could wipe out potentially the entire population.
Yeah.
But anyhow, that was a very, that's the only time I've seen anything like it in near 50 years that I've been on the river, but it was a very unique situation.
I've never forgotten that time, because back in 2021, when I was up in Saskatchewan, I had 130 whooping cranes in front of me, and I'm blind one night. And a lot of those birds then, like we said earlier, migrated down the Great Plains together and ended up here. A good chunk of them ended up here for a time. As these birds begin to increase at roughly what it is now, about 4% a year, they're beginning to learn how to be a flock together again. And I always think about these extreme weather events, and particularly with the native fierceness of our weather systems here in the Great Plains anyway, now, cranked up even more, with more energy in the atmosphere, and, warming and all that.
A different year, but in that same time frame, in the 90s, maybe you can remember the year, but we had a similar thing happen with snow geese, where it was, a big weather event, and they were thousands and thousands of snow geese that were killed.
That was a tornado that had gone from, I think, northeastern Webster County all the way up into Colfax County. And it windrowed the geese as it went through York County, and killed an estimated 20 to 30,000 snow geese.
Do you remember the year of that?
I haven't written down.
It was in the 90s, I'm sure.
And these sandhill cranes, I ended up preparing like 77 of those specimens for the museum. And the physical damage to these things crashing into the ground, and those geese as well. The storm damage, it was just, some of them exploded internally when they hit the ground.
You mentioned starting to flock more. I know a couple episodes ago on the podcast, they were talking about the virus now, and the concern there, I guess we haven't even talked about back in the day, they had foul cholera, the rainwater basins was a big concern. Fortunately, I don't think it ever did much to sandhill cranes or whooping cranes, but I just, got curious and going back through some diaries. One of the first whooping cranes I saw was down at Moses Hill Basin, I believe. And I was with Jim Hurt, an old waterfowl biologist, and we actually hazed the whooping cranes from there because there was foul cholera in the air, and they had a plane up in the air, and they tried to move them on and encourage their migration to get the heck out of here. So hearing you say that they're starting to flock and enjoy being that just kind of raises your red flags a little bit too, as well as the great news that you have them.
Thomas, I visited you in your collections several times over the years at the University of Nebraska State Museum. You've showed me sandhill cranes. Now I know maybe I've seen some of the ones that we talked about from the 90s. You also showed me some whooping cranes. Can you tell me about those?
When I began at the museum, one of the things that was really, I thought, lacking from the collections was skeletons. And we have this huge paleo department, which relies on skeletal material for comparison. And the Pleistocene is the common fossil source in Nebraska. So that would include cranes. And we need skeletal representation.
And Pleistocene is, for our listeners,
yeah, good.
Long time ago.
the end of the Pleistocene, the last ice age we had here was roughly around 15,000 years.
I'm a biologist, not a geologist.
Right.
Yeah, so,
Older than we are.
a little bit. I vaguely remember part of it. Going through the biologists at Patuxent, etc., I was able to procure 3 dead whooping cranes for the collections. One of which was a colt, maybe 2 or 3 weeks old, and I preserved that whole in fluid alcohol in case anybody ever needed to look at musculature development or something like that. And the other 2, one was a subadult and the other was an adult. And one had been necropsied pretty hard. They had really cut into it, and I didn't even try to make a skin. I saved some feathers or a wing or something, but made a complete skeleton. And the other one, I made a complete skin and a complete skeleton out of for comparison. But they were all from captivity. But what a privilege, having worked on so many dozens of sandhill cranes, and then to be able to work on a whooping crane. And then also in my career, to have helped maintain the specimens, taxidermy specimens of whooping cranes. I've helped advise other institutions on how to care for theirs, cared for ours. And boy, this is dredging up some memories of sometime maybe around 1990 or something. Somebody from the federal labs came by, and they were going to every collection that had whooping cranes, and they were taking a little patch of belly skin and a feather or 2, and they were going to look at the DNA, and they were going to look to see if there was a genetic bottleneck, because many of these were prior to the low population of the early 1900s. Most of these were 1800 specimens. Wow. And I don't know whatever came of that work.
Did you ever get specimens from Nebraska that you know of in the museum? Or?
No. Other than taxidermy from the old ones, yes.
The
Similar
Hastings Museum was known to have the largest
exhibit
of whooping.
And I asked that. I don't know if there were others, but at least one whooping crane mortality that was salvaged, I know, was down in Red Willow County when I was working there. Of course, the protocol was to take it to the federal agent, and wherever it went from there, I don't know. But we did have a Nebraska bird that at least started here, and it could have been a devil.
Yeah, that wasn't one of them. But there was a protocol, and I was on the list. But I really wonder what happened to that work on the DNA and the bottleneck.
There you go.
I don't know. I know there's another
Season 2.
the geneticist in the room. That'd be something. That would have to be guest hosted because.
But it's always been a privilege to work on cranes, and to the event that Gary talked about with so many dead cranes. We're used to looking out over a field and seeing cranes walking and dancing, but I was out there 2 days later, and you look over the field, and all you see are dead cranes. A leg sticking up, a wing sticking up, or some feathers stuck to barbed wire. It was really horrific.
One of the concerns with whooping cranes in particular is, as far as mortality goes, and these weather events, and whether it be fog or winds or collision with power lines. And we were always concerned flying during these surveys, hoping that we wouldn't encounter, a bird that had struck a power line, a whooping crane in particular. And I don't know if you were flying that day or not, but on one of the flights out by Lexington, we were crossing that big transmission line in the airplane. Looked down, there was a big white blob in the river, obviously dead, obviously a large bird. Oh my gosh, we found the first mortality of a whooping crane. So we went out with the ground crew later, and fortunately not for the bird, but from our perspective, it was a pelican, right?
Yeah.
But exactly.
You ever handle whooping cranes, Gary?
I never have, no.
And the reason I just asked that, watching some of your podcasts, really interesting, some of the people you interview that have all these intimate experiences with those birds. And now you're talking to a bunch of old guys that saw them from a distance or were around them, and kind of different experiences, but there's probably still some intimate time, spent with those birds, but certainly the distance.
Well, that's the way we want it, I think, in a way, right? You had a few intimate experiences with these birds at a distance, Greg.
Yeah, there's one that just kind of jumps out. One of my favorite spots are times with them. And part of my job, like I say, I got to do the fun stuff. But back in the day, our main kind of objective was just try to document where these birds might be landing in the state. So run around and try to confirm all the possible sightings we had. We had protocol to do that. So I used the term babysit. We would be there with them 24/7 as long as we had staff that could do it. And that staff might be myself and a conservation officer that was interested in it. But I just remember spending, I think, 4 or 5 days with a couple birds up there north of Whitman a bit, back in a ranch.
Deep in the heart of the sandhills.
Heart of the sandhills, this beautiful property and a wetland, just beautiful wetland, and just sitting there for 5 days watching the birds do whatever they were doing. At that time, we weren't even trying to collect information. It was just living there with them, mainly trying to, we would be concerned if anybody would come in and try to disturb them. And that was it. I guess nothing very specific other than that's a pretty special deal to be paid to sit there and watch birds for 5 days.
Were you ever in a blind here at Rose Sanctuary and had whooping cranes?
Lot of blinds. In fact, you and your wife were down in one of my favorite blinds, maybe yours, on the north side of the river here at Roe. One night sitting there, and of course we had bald eagles playing around out there in front of us. You had sandhill cranes all over the place. I was hoping we'd have a river otter. Didn't see one there that night. We were explaining to our friends about these whooping cranes and how cool they were. A couple of them were from Minden, grew up in Minden, Nebraska. And pelicans, a line of pelicans, 50 or 80 doing their sine curve flight, came by, and pretty soon one of the ladies said, well, I think one of those whooping cranes just landed on the river down there, and we kind of poo-pooed it and said, I'm sure that's some of the pelicans, and looked down there, and I can't remember if it was 7 or 9. My wife claims it might even been more than that. Whooping cranes eventually, and some of them ended up right in front of us and roosted there. So, yeah.
Was Martha with you?
Pretty special night. Martha Carlee or Taha was there. Yeah. Janine Latke was there.
Oh, wow. I was on the road with a friend.
Yes.
We watched those things come in and thinking, a friend was doing the similar thing, talking about whooping cranes. Yeah, this is the time of year you might see them, and I'm just watching the sky. All the sandhill cranes are everywhere, and there's some whooping cranes right there. Oh, well, sometimes the light plays with you, and look over it. Sure enough, and they landed right in front of you guys. I remember that, and I remember one of them ended up 100 yards upstream from us, right at dark, and so I assume that's where it spent the night, but pretty interesting because of all this stuff going on and everybody's whispering and being excited, and after the moment of catching your breath and you saw the birds, and it was just quiet. It's like church, church quiet. That's what they do to you.
Have any of you seen these birds somewhere other than Nebraska?
Only in captivity.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's all Nebraska, yeah.
First whooping crane I saw was my senior year college spring break at Aransas. Went and did the boat thing.
Okay.
So, at a distance sort of a deal.
Yeah.
Through binoculars. But, yeah.
My life whooping crane was at Buffer Lake, Saskatchewan, the 2nd of October in 1980. There were 6 of them out there on that wetland. We were attending a Whooping Crane Conservation Association meeting in Regina there, and that was our field trip, and that was the first time I'd ever seen them. The second sighting that was at Grays Lake in Idaho, where they were doing this cross-fostering program with sandhill cranes, having the sandhill cranes raise whooping crane from the egg. And that was in August of 81. And there were 2 that we'd seen, and that was in conjunction with a crane workshop that was being held at
The North American Crane.
North American
Yeah.
Crane Working Group.
Yeah, right.
That group, I founded that group. I don't know if you realize it.
No shit.
I founded it.
Wow.
We were, yeah. We were at a crane workshop down in Kissimmee, Florida.
Yeah.
And George Archibald and a couple other people, we were sitting in a hot tub. They started talking about the need for having this group, and all eyes were looking at me, and of course the affiliation at that time with the Crane Trust. And I thought, well, that'd be a good connection. It's a good place to have operation out of. And they asked if I would be willing to take this thing on and make it more formal. It was pretty much an informal group. I think the first workshop was in the late 70s and up through that time. But in 1988, I formally got the group incorporated here in the state of Nebraska, and I was the first CEO and founding member for that for a long time, and it's still going today.
It is still going today. I think the last one was, I was there, it was in Baraboo, Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Around the time that the International Crane Foundation had their 50th anniversary.
Oh, yeah.
And I think they're trying to settle on where the next one's going to be. Maybe it should be back here.
Right. And the idea was about every 4 years or so to have a workshop.
Yeah. I'll throw you a big party.
What took you to Kissimmee, Florida?
It was a crane workshop.
And why was it there, I guess?
Well,
they started the non-migratory experiment down there at the time.
No, this was with sand cranes primarily. I mean, it was, we went to Kissimmee because of the Florida sand cranes. The field trips were in the spring, and we were down there looking at nesting birds down there and that sort of thing. The idea was to move around different parts of the country where cranes occurred and learn a little bit about the biology of these birds in various parts of the continent. So, that group met in Canada.
They even went down to Zacatecas in Mexico once, or somewhere in that neighborhood. But it's every few years now they get together, and it's just a big community of. I mean, a lot of managers and scientists and such that are actively involved every day, but also increasingly there's students, graduate students, and others. People like me that they'll let in the room and be a fly on the wall. And it's really cool, Gary. I'm really glad to hear that you started that. That's amazing. I keep looking. You got one other thing on the table here. Gary.
I can throw some numbers out at you.
I'd love to hear some numbers. And
I kind of put together a summary of the 15 years that we were doing this survey.
And explain the survey, or frame the survey again.
The survey, the Whooping Crane survey, was an effort by the recently formed Platte River Recovery Program just to monitor the use of the Platte River by whooping cranes.
Yeah.
So I was hired and have been involved with that survey from 2001 was the first one that we conducted, and the last one that I was involved with was the spring of 2015. So it was a 14-year period that I was involved with. It's still going on today. But during that time, our group, we would fly 2 planes every morning. There'd be 2 observers in the plane, and then have 2 ground observers. And 1 plane would fly half of this 90-mile reach, starting roughly from Chapman to the Minden Bridge. The other group would fly roughly 45 miles from the Minden Bridge to Lexington. So anyhow, during that time, we flew about 120,000 miles. We were able to conduct anywhere from 60 to 90% of the flights because of weather issues would definitely ground you. A total of 267 whooping cranes were observed by the air crew. So the largest group we saw was 11. And the most we saw in a migration was 38. We collected 950 hours of time budget data. We had over 1,000 hours of habitat data, 842 crane use days. And crane use days is defined as, see, if you have a group of 3 birds that were here 2 days, there would be 6 crane use days. One of the interesting things that we noticed is that the family groups would spend more time in wetlands, particularly in the fall, than the non-family groups. And wetlands were used more in the fall than in the spring, as opposed to corn fields being the highest use area in the spring versus fall. And it wasn't because the corn wasn't harvested in the fall. We don't really know the reason, but I always thought that maybe part of the reason was that, these chicks and families coming off their nesting grounds, their whole world is a wetland.
Yeah.
And so they're more familiar with foraging and feeding wetlands, and that may be why they spend more time on the wetland areas, the family groups in particular, in the fall than they did in the spring. One of the other behavioral things that we noticed prior to migration, oftentimes the birds would leave the river early in the morning, come back to the river, or some other water source. They'd take a drink before they'd migrate. Yeah. And then pretty soon off they would go. You hear that trumpeting call and watching them migrate and having the privilege of being there as these birds migrated and left the valley. I mean, that was always something special I looked forward to every migration.
What is that like to watch a whooping crane leave?
It just sends chills through you. I mean, you just think of this incredible bird. I mean, the tallest bird in North America. The history with it, the fact that their nesting grounds were known prior to the early 50s, and all these years of whooping cranes and not knowing that where they were actually nesting up at wood buffalo outside of some of the prairie areas that they used that they were extirpated from. But anyhow, to me, it's almost spiritual.
To me, it's just effortless. I mean, like Gary said, you could pick up cues. His was drinking, but if you sit with birds for 5 days, and they do the classic pre-flight, but they're just you just get the feeling they're ready to go, and then when they go and they just spiral and they get up there, and every once in a while you can see a flash, and then our job for a while was to try to follow them as far as you could, because sometimes they'd come back or they'd go sit in another one. To me, it was just effortless when they go, and you mentioned spiritual. And
one of the things I remember in the spring of 1984, this was the last migration of a radio tracking project, the first one on whooping cranes, and by today's standards, that was very, very primitive. I mean, we had a beeper and a receiver in the plane, and they would keep track of the birds, and then a radio communication with the ground crew. Mm-hmm. Well, there was a pair of whooping cranes that had landed out. They were utilized an area by Hershey, Nebraska.
North Platte, Ernie Kite. Yeah.
And the crew that was watching them, the birds stayed for 3 weeks. And in Blankenship and some of these other folks that were part of that crew,
They were tired of it.
They had other obligations. I mean, they had life to live, right? You know, they weren't expecting to be 3 weeks there. So somehow or another, they called the second team, I guess we call it. And I volunteered. Man, that'd be cool. I'd like to follow those birds. And so I got together with trying to find someone else to help go along on this adventure. And it turned out that Ken Strom, who was the manager here at Rose Sanctuary at the time, said, "Yeah, I'll go." And so, okay, well, let's do it. We'll relieve these guys, however long it takes. We'll just commit to it. Well, the day after we got the vehicle set up so that we could communicate with the plane with radio, they migrated. So we weren't on them at all in Nebraska. I mean, they migrated the first day. And that experience following these birds north to Roseanne was pretty neat. I remember driving downtown Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and looking up and seeing the plane and the whooping crane. And we're in the traffic light, stopped at the traffic light, looking at these things migrating over town. Everybody obviously oblivious to what was going on. But another experience that I remember is they the first night they bypassed South Dakota, and they wound up in a wetland in North Dakota. And it happened to be on the path of these training flights from Minot Air Force Base. These B-52s were flying. And we were there on the ground one morning watching these two birds out in the wetland. And all of a sudden, all hell broke loose on this wetland. I mean, all the other shorebirds and ducks and other birds in that wetland just started taking off. And what's going on? The whooping cranes paid no attention, and pretty soon this B-52 came flying over. It wasn't very high off the ground, but I mean directly over. And that concussion from those engines about blew us out of the truck. Those whooping cranes, they just looked up and right back were doing this. Everything else was gone.
So a couple of things I got to throw in there. I raised my hand, but my boss, who I saw, Ross Locke, a week and a half ago, did not let me go. So that would have been fun. But at some point in time, the technology you mentioned wasn't very good. And listening to your friend Dave Brandt talk about the work they're doing and what they can learn. And he had made a comment in that podcast that, they just had the ability to start really looking hard to answer some questions, and he made the comment there was a lot of anecdotal and observational information up to that point in time, and a lot of it was because the technology just wasn't there I had a quote early Apple Watch. I think the first year I was watching whooping cranes, I had this watch that I could put phone numbers in. Somehow I could put phone numbers in there of the people that I would go to the telephone booth and call that night to say, okay, I confirmed these Ross Locke or Wally Jobman who did that. So it's just, there's an old timer story. It's just like we did some interesting things with what we had, but boy, there were limits.
I'd never heard the B-52 story. But I also remember being on babysitting birds over by Wilcox, and the first day we rolled up to watch them, every time anybody spoke, the birds perked up. And if somebody shut a car door, they perked up. And by the end of the third or fourth day, they were used to us being here. But they were so nervous, just us talking. That's okay. And then the B-52 goes over and okay.
Big bird.
Yeah. What kind of calming drugs are they on? Yes.
I think another thing that has, over my years of working with these birds, through my own observations, but more so just through the communication, talking with friends of mine and colleagues like you all, is how resilient these birds are.
Exactly.
It's remarkable that I still think, that these birds were down till 21 birds in the world in the early 1940s, 15 in this Aransas to Wood Buffalo corridor, and that somehow, some way, they have come back to roughly 540 birds today.
Yeah.
And it makes me then think about the future of these birds and our responsibility, I guess. So I guess if you could wave your magic wand, or if you had a crystal ball, you had one wish, what would it be for these birds in the future? Realistically, I mean, what does the future hold?
I want to look back before I look forward. 20,000 years in the evolution of these birds is not a very long period of time, but 20,000 years ago from where we're sitting, we probably would be looking at an ice sheet. So they are very resilient. Things have changed immensely. What was the Platte even here? This was a boreal forest of some kind 20,000 years ago, and they have survived all those changes. And we are continuing to impact and change the environment, particularly the climate. And I hope they are resilient enough to change their ways as we change the climate and habitats around them. I think about the fires, the Canadian fires every summer. I think a lot about those. And I think about our storm systems here, and I think about rising sea levels in the Texas coast. And I hope we can provide areas for them to be resilient and move to, because they have shown that they can do that. I'm hopeful, but we have to put in the work. And no magic wands, just hard work.
Thank you, Thomas. Gary?
I'm optimistic. I mean, they have shown a resilience and perseverance in the past, and there's no reason in my mind to think that they can't continue in that way in the future. You know, obviously things do change, and nobody can predict what this landscape's going to look like 20,000 years from now. There may not be any life on Earth at that time, who knows? But as long as we have a planet that is functioning as it is today, then tomorrow seems bright to me. I mean, I look at what's happened here on the Platte in terms of protection. You know, when I started here, there was no in-stream flow protection. There were very little areas set aside for conservation. The Roe Sanctuary was the first. And from that original acquisition, I don't remember the number of acres, to the 20,000 plus acres that are protected now. And the numbers of not only swooping cranes have increased, but the sandhill cranes. Evidently this year we had 750,000 sandhill cranes according to the surveys that were done, which far exceeds any numbers that were thrown out 30 years ago in terms of the entire world's population of sandhill cranes. So life is adaptable. It will persist, and I'm optimistic.
Thanks, Gary. Greg?
I'd like to think I'm optimistic and hopeful. I'm more maybe kind of like, because it's hard. I mean, and maybe part of this is, you know, fighting some of the water battles on the Platte. And like I said, I recently talked to Ross Locke and Dave Carlson out there, and I know some people that spent, you know, a good part of their career trying to do good things for cranes, and it's, you know, you get burned out. The people that don't, they just amaze me. And I know there are people that don't get burned out, but one I thought about just now is, you know, in one of your podcasts, the name Marty Folk came up.
Yeah, in Florida.
From Florida. And when your book came out, I sent books to several people, and Marty was one of them. And Marty called me back, and I kind of asked him, you know, about the Florida experience, and what, they're down to maybe one bird that's still there that they haven't captured and moved off. And Marty was a guy, unlike me and maybe many others, that just kind of found their way into cranes. Marty planned to work with cranes his whole life and did his master's study on sandhills. He was my roommate out in North Platte for a year. goes down there, gets his dream job, for Fish and Game, the head guy, working on the resident flock down there. He surprised me when I asked him, tell me the latest. He said, when I walked away from that, when we said basically it's a failure, he said I couldn't think about it anymore. But it's kind of interesting. I sent him your book, and he said I'm going to have to get back into it. So it's hard, I guess. About the time you get some optimism, something happens. Like I hear him talking about the Perkins County Canal here in Nebraska again. Monday was the deadline for submitting comments on a rule change for the Fish and Wildlife Service, taking the definition of harm out of take on, which would be a huge deal if that gets done. So it's hard to think about that. I guess what I have faith in is just the number of people that come behind you and are going to stand up and fight those fights, and young, passionate people. And there seems to be just that growing flock of those. So that's what gives me the hope, I guess, even in spite of the obstacles that we're constantly throwing out there at them.
Well, I'm glad you all have hope, because I do too. It's that old adage, you're standing on the shoulders of those that came before you, and hopefully, others will be standing on yours once you leave. But it takes all of us each in our own way. That's been one of the real fun things about talking to you all is just to see the community that these birds somehow have brought together. And if we'd all go stand out on a sandbar and roost at night, all of us, we'd all look very different from each other, and we'd all have these different experiences and places we've come from and where we're going. But we're all bound by, argue to say, is love, not just these birds, but for the world that we're a part of, and that's a really special thing. So
if I could wave the wand, like you said, although you said keep it reasonable, it'd be to figure out a way to have water, in the Platte River.
And how much water are we going to have?
Oh, yeah.
If we get a snowpack in the Rockies, if we have more communities pulling it out for municipal purposes, it's going to get a little rougher. We need some really good long-term climate change planning that we can count on as we see these things.
The best habitats you see here at Roe or down at the Truss are there because people are making sure they are there. That's the thing. It's so sad that it can't be, the whole functioning river like that it takes the amount of intervention. But that's the way it is, and that's the way it'll always be, I guess.
Well, I'll tell you that I use the Platte River a lot as an example of what works, though, too, in the sense that when we started this conversation, we started talking about all the different partners, and frankly, the different entities, agencies that you all collectively have worked for. If you think about state and federal agencies and NGOs and university and et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know if there's another place that I can think about off the top of my head anyway in North America that has so many conservation partners in such a small geographic area working on one thing together, and not everybody agrees with everybody all the time, I know. But you still share equipment, still share ideas, you still share community together, and to me that's the only
Burning crews.
Only way. Yeah, burning crews, all that stuff. So, I think Platte Valley holds a really fine example of part of that hope that you all talk about, and also we have to be clear-eyed about some of these issues like water. I mean, no water, the show stops. Period.
Right.
No finish line. Right.
Just so many individuals. That you mentioned your book, just connect, Hooping Friends connects, but I've known Gary for 45 years. And think about it, Tom maybe 40, I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
And just think of all the people in the network out there. Yeah. Pretty amazing to get to sit back and think about that and relive a little bit of it. I appreciate this.
Yeah. All right. Well, very good. We do hope to do another season of this. So you might end up having y'all back for round 2. But for now, we'll call it a day. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, you're
Thank
welcome.
you, Greg, for sharing your time, your stories, and your lifelong dedication to conservation. It's been a joy to sit down with you and hear about the stories from those early days on the Platte. Your work has left a legacy that I know will continue to inspire future generations. These are the Whooping Crane Chronicles. Thank you for joining. Stay tuned.